Morning light entered the clearing through leafless branches above. A shelter leaned against a low rock face, framed with curved saplings and covered in cured hides. Its walls were made from red deerskin, scraped with flint flakes, and softened using a slurry of water, animal brains, and physical working, a method confirmed by hide analysis and modern experiments. Smoke curing, done days earlier, had added durability and water resistance. This type of structure, though temporary, reflects the kind of built shelter inferred from post-hole patterns, hearth distributions, and debris clusters in sites like Mezhirich and Dolny Vestonice. Inside, a man stirred near the fire. He brushed aside the fine ash covering the hearth and revealed a dim red glow beneath. This technique, insulating embers to preserve heat overnight, is supported by stratified hearth deposits, seen in sites like Abri Plateau. The man added curls of birch bark and dry pine needles, both known for their high resin content, and blew gently until flame flickered back to life. 2 children woke nearby and came to the fire. One crouched and fed in small sticks. The other picked up a cracked pebble from the fire ring, inspecting the way the heat had split it. Imitation was the primary mode of learning. There was no explanation, no instruction, just close attention to tasks. This aligns with ethnographic observations of foragers like the Hadza, where children learn by participating rather than being taught. Archaeological support for this includes child-sized flake scars, miniature tools, and incomplete work surfaces scattered alongside adult-use debris. The man turned to a bundle of hazel shafts stored off the ground. Hazel was chosen for its straight grain and pliability, ideal for making spears and digging tools. It was harvested weeks earlier, stripped, and left to dry. The man selected one and brought it to the hearth, where heat from the fire would make minor corrections easier. He used a flint flake to scrape it smooth. The flake, struck from a river cobble using hard hammer percussion and refined with pressure flaking, was sharp and durable. Such tools were often carried long distances, and cores could be reused many times. Flint sourced from distant geological regions confirms the high mobility and planning in raw material use. One of the children attempted the same motion with a duller tool, mimicking the wrist movement. Another chewed a strip of dried tendon, softening it to later be used for binding. Sinew, taken from animal backs and legs, contracts as it dries and was widely used in the hafting of spear points. Use wear and residue analyses confirm its presence on stone tips recovered from open-air sites and caves throughout Eurasia. Near the scraped shaft lay a prepared stone spear point, triangular, slightly concave, and pressure-flaked along both edges. The hafting would involve a mix of pine pitch and beeswax, then tight wrapping with the sinew the child was preparing. Pine pitch as an adhesive has been chemically confirmed at Königsaue and other sites. It was heated to a pliable consistency and applied with a stick or fingers. Experimental archaeology shows that this mix produces a flexible, water-resistant glue. The rest of the camp was coming to life. A woman unwrapped a bundle of bark strips and fibers and laid them beside a worn slab of sandstone. She would spin the fiber into cord, likely for bindings or netting. Although cord rarely survives in dry sites, its impressions are found on fired clay and tools, suggesting that Paleolithic people had an established fiber industry, especially for tool and clothing manufacture. Bark cordage was also used to fasten frame joints and repair torn hides. Nearby, a group of flint cores lay beside a discarded antler tine. The flakes had been struck, retouched, and stored for later use. Some showed dull edges from hide scraping, others were fine and fresh. This practice of using and resharpening blades rather than discarding them reflects the high value of quality stone, especially in regions where flint or obsidian was scarce. Carrying cores across long distances is a pattern supported by sourcing studies in Central and Western Europe, where non-local materials often appear in tool assemblages. The fire, now steady, was being used to warm stones for heating a bark-lined pit. Water and yesterday's root mash sat nearby. Without pottery, Paleolithic groups boiled water by heating stones in a fire and dropping them into hide or bark containers. Burnt, cracked stones in archaeological hearths provide clear evidence of this cooking method. The boiling helped release starches and soften roots, a significant addition to calorie intake, especially during lean seasons. One child worked to bind a practice point onto a shaft. Another handed off chewed sinew. The man adjusted the younger's grip, then stepped back. These interactions mirror the kind of learning inferred from child-sized tools and small napping areas, seen in layers at places like Etioi, which show parallel engagement in the tasks of older individuals. A dog-like animal paced through the clearing, sniffed the base of the drying rack, and lay down beside the fire. Genetic and morphological evidence from canard remains at sites like Goye and Bonoba Castle suggest domestication was beginning during this period. Wolves that lingered near human camps may have slowly adapted to scavenging and human tolerance, eventually becoming semi-dependent. Today would not be a travel day or a hunt. It was a work day, one of the many needed to keep the group prepared. Spears were maintained, fibers spun, cord dried, knowledge passed from hand to hand. Everything they used, from the hide stretched overhead to the stone edge in the man's hand, came from memory, repetition, and shared work. These moments left traces, cut-marked bones, flakes, hearth layers, and the occasional bead or tooth, pierced with care. But most of it, the plant fibers, the whispers, the learning, vanished into the soil, leaving only the things too durable to rot. Mist lingered low across the forest floor. The man stepped out from the camp, joined by two others. All three carried their tools, spears with sharpened stone points, slings of gut cord, flint blades tucked into hide belts. Each item was shaped by hand and showed signs of use, re-wrapped bindings, retouched edges, and wear-along hafts. These tools were personal, but communal in function. They served the group, not just the maker. They moved quietly along a familiar trail, their footsteps avoided dry twigs. The man knelt near a patch of disturbed leaves. There were hoofprints. Red deer. A small group had passed recently. One had a dragging step. He pressed a hand into the soil. Moist, still soft. The tracks were fresh. Manchoeti tweti tweti. They didn't speak. A hand gesture. A look. One man circled left toward a ridge. The second stayed close, preparing a flake blade. The man followed the trail forward. The ground was marked by breaks in ferns and damp scat, all signs that reinforced the reading of movement. Such tracking required a practiced eye, honed by years of exposure, and guided by knowledge passed down through behavior, not instruction. A child followed at a distance. Too far to interfere, but close enough to see. The man made no signal to send them back. Learning came by being present. The child crouched near a tree, copying the way the man held still. No words were spoken. Skills were absorbed through repetition and proximity. At the edge of a shallow ravine, the man stopped. The deer had likely passed through to reach water. He settled behind a rock and waited. The second hunter took a position across the dip. The third flushed forward through brush. The wind shifted. It was enough. Crashing hooves. A brown blur. The deer bolted uphill, beyond reach. They hadn't been close enough. There was no kill. They met again in the ravine. No one was angry. It was expected. Not every day ended in meat. They turned back. On the way, one of the men found early garlic shoots under a downed tree. Another spotted a rabbit and dropped it with a sling stone. A quick, practiced throw. These moments mattered. Even a small kill gave food, sinew, hide and bone. The meat would be roasted, the sinew dried and stored, nothing wasted. At camp, the hearth was burning. A woman was scraping a strip of tendon against stone, separating fibers. This sinew would be used for binding spear points and sewing hide. Another used a flint flake to trim a hide edge, checking the cut with her thumb. Nearby, bark cord was being twisted from plant fiber, a time-consuming but critical task. A child sat with a small wooden shaft and practiced binding a bone point. The hands were clumsy but steady. The man watched, then corrected the grip with a quick motion. No lecture followed. This mirrored the pattern seen at sites like Etioli, where juvenile flake scars suggest active learning through imitation. The rabbit was skinned and cleaned. The organs were removed first. Fatty pieces went into a cooking pit where stones were already hot. The bones would be boiled later to extract marrow. Heart layers from sites like Dolny Vesternice show repeated bone-boiling pits, clusters of charred stones, ash, and cracked bones that speak to everyday food preparation and fat extraction. The child who had followed the hunt sat near the fire. A spear was across their lap. Not yet sharp, but shaped. The man adjusted the point and turned it in the light. Satisfied, he handed it back. A dog-like animal paced through the clearing, sniffed the base of the drying rack, and lay down beside the fire. Genetic and morphological evidence from canid remains at sites like Goye and Bono Bakaso suggest domestication was beginning during this period. Wolves that lingered near human camps may have slowly adapted to scavenging and human tolerance, eventually becoming semi-dependent. Today would not be a travel day or a hunt. It was a work day, one of the many needed to keep the group prepared. Spears were maintained, fibers spun, cord dried, knowledge passed from hand to hand. Everything they used, from the hide stretched overhead to the stone edge in the man's hand, came from memory, repetition, and shared work. These moments left traces, cut-marked bones, flakes, hearth layers, and the occasional bead or tooth pierced with care. But most of it, the plant fibers, the whispers, the learning, vanished into the soil, leaving only the things too durable to rot. The other child helped a woman peel the outer bark from a reed. This would be used for twine or as insulation in bedding. Grasses and plant matter don't often survive in open-air sites, but compressed layers and residue found in waterlogged contexts like Ohelo Zwei suggest that bedding and mats were common. As the sun lowered, the camp settled. The fire crackled. The rabbit roasted. Smoke lifted into the trees. Curious. The man sat back against a stone and looked out over the group. Flint, sinew, shoots, hide, cord, heat. The deer had escaped, but the day had not been wasted. Everything mattered. Every motion, every piece. Knowledge came through doing. The ground had offered signs. They had been read. Others would be too. Before dawn, the man joined two others preparing for a long walk. They carried spears with retouched flint tips, hide slings, flake knives, and twisted gut cord wrapped at their waists. A hide bundle was packed with sinew, bark strips, and spare resin for repairs. These were not extras, they were necessary. Every tool had been shaped, repaired, and used over many days. They moved south toward a marsh where animals often passed at daybreak. Mist covered the low ground. They walked in a line, keeping quiet. One of them raised a hand and pointed. A section of reeds had been pushed aside. Mud showed fresh prints, broad hooves, deep tracks. Wild boar. Dran and mile escotag, dran on breeze. A difficult target. Fast, aggressive, hard to bring down. But fat-rich, with strong hide and usable bones. Drown, the group spread out. One man took the right flank. The second moved through the reeds to flush. The man waited, crouched behind a tangle of brush, beating arts out. Emora prash, the reeds parted. Emora prasta powered. Emora prower canamrik. The reeds parted. Emora prowed. Emora prower canamrik. Emora prowed. Emora prowed. The man stepped out, drove the spear low into its side. A shriek, thrashing. Another spear struck from the flank. The animal collapsed in the mud, twitching. Then still. Braras prashing. There was no cheering. They moved in quickly. The kill was bled and gutted on sight. The heart and liver were eaten immediately, warm, dense, and full of nutrients. Ethnographic data from Arctic and steppe foragers support this pattern. Nutrient-rich organs were consumed fresh, on the spot. The hide was removed in one long piece. A flint flake was used to make the first cuts, followed by a retouched scraper to separate skin from muscle. The bones were split, and marrow taken out with smooth stones. Archaeological evidence shows long bone fracturing consistent with marrow extraction, as well as percussion pits from repeated cracking. They wrapped meat, bones, and organs in an older hide and lashed it with cord. The return was slow and heavy. At camp, the fire was rebuilt and burning hot. Racks were set up using green branches, meat was laid over them to smoke, a hide-lined pit was filled with water, and hot stones were dropped in to boil fat and cook scraps. This method of indirect boiling is seen in many Upper Paleolithic sites, where concentrations of fire-cracked stones suggest repeated cooking events. Children helped by carrying sticks and placing bark sheets beneath drying racks. One child chewed a strip of sinew while another scraped grease from a femur using a curved flake. The woman with the grinding stone began preparing dried root for a mash. A stone slab and handstone were used. The powder was poured into bark containers and boiled using fire-heated stones. The man sat by the fire, rechecking the spearhead that had killed the boar. The tip was chipped. he would need to rework it. One child helped him heat a piece of pitch. He mixed it with ash and wax, forming a sticky adhesive. The flake point was pressed into a split in the shaft and bound tightly with chewed sinew. The spear was now ready again. This technique, resin glue and sinew wrap, is known from tool residue and haft marks in sites such as Königsauer and Hohlefels. As the sun lowered, smoke drifted across the camp. The meat dried slowly, the boiled fat thickened. Bones were stacked for later use, tool making or fuel. Bark cords hung from a pole, drying in the heat. The child who had helped with the spear now sat beside it, watching the fire. Another added a pebble to the boiling pit to keep it hot. Busy. The kill had been clean, the day had been full, nothing was wasted. Dire. They would eat well that night, busy. The day after the hunt was for repair, cooking, and making use of everything the boar had provided. The camp was quiet but active. Ash from the fire covered the coals, holding in heat. Smoke drifted upward into the morning air. The man sat near the fire with a spear across his knees. A cracked binding needed replacing. He untied the old sinew and scraped the residue of pitch from the shaft. A child brought over a strip of chewed tendon and placed it beside the spear. Another held the knife used to lift the old flint point. These interactions were common and reflected in the archaeological record. Unfinished bindings, worn edges, and recycled tools all suggest hands-on group learning, not verbal instruction. The new point was already shaped, pressure-flaked from high-quality river flint, its edges still bright. He heated a blob of pitch mixed with beeswax over a flat stone. When the mix softened, he pressed it into the haft, slid in the point, and began wrapping it tightly with softened sinew. This process has been reconstructed through experimental archaeology and mirrors residue and fracture evidence seen on hafted blades across Europe. Elsewhere in the camp, a woman sat with a pile of split roots beside a grinding slab. She passed a stone back and forth, reducing dried pieces into fine powder. The plant had been gathered in a previous season and dried for storage. Once ground, it was added to a bark-lined pit filled with water. Hot stones were pulled from the fire with split sticks and dropped into the pit to cook the mash. Indirect boiling methods like this, using heated stones in watertight hide or bark containers, have left dense clusters of fire-cracked rocks in the archaeological layers of campsites like Pavlov and Dolny Vestanice. These stones often show repeated heating cycles and are found beside charred pits and organic residue. Children moved between tasks. One was fletching a dart, twisting sinew around feather shafts. The angle of each feather mattered. The balance and spin had to be right. A poorly fletched dart would drift or fail to penetrate. Another child arranged bones by size near the fire. Some would be shaped into tools, others drilled for beads. Hexaosas. 80. The old man, not injured, but past hunting age, sat near the central hearth. He held a stick in one hand and began a story. His voice was quiet. He described a hunt long ago. He mimicked the sound of hooves, the breathing of prey, the crack of a spear. The children stopped moving. They listened. These stories weren't just entertainment. They transmitted knowledge about animals, about terrain, about danger. Cave art from sites like Lascaux and Chauvet may have functioned similarly, storing memory and instruction through gesture and symbol. The storytelling reinforced group memory and created a shared frame of reference. Suluxi, Tronjak Shenahaus Putul, Tronjasaba Vary, a trail, a bend, a ridge. One child added a pebble to show a deer's location. Another shifted twigs to suggest a new ambush point. This kind of play acting served as planning. Even the arrangement of objects became rehearsal for survival. Near one of the sleeping areas, two women drilled small holes into fox teeth using stone awls. The teeth would be strung onto sinew and worn. Such ornaments, found across Upper Paleolithic burial sites like Sonjir and Dolny Vestonice, were not merely decorative. Their distribution, wear and number suggest identity markers or group affiliation. The labor invested in them implies significance beyond utility. A child sat cross-legged and threaded a series of teeth onto a line of gut cord. The holes were uneven, but the thread held. The woman beside her tightened the knot, then handed the bead loop back. Elsewhere in camp, another was preparing bedding, layering grasses and moss into a dry section beneath the overhang. While plant remains rarely survive, Waterlogged sites like Ohelo Swai have preserved grass mats and bedding layers, confirming that such comfort and insulation were maintained with care. The fire remained central. Cooking, tool repair, ornament making, and rest all revolved around it. Even the dog-like animal, resting by the woodpile, stayed near the heat. As dusk came, the camp quieted. The story ended. The fletching was tied. The meat smoked. The beads were stored. Biles along Gokul. Nothing important was written down. Everything was remembered, in hands, in habits, in heat and smoke. It started with wind, a low shift in air pressure, a sharpness in the scent, damp and metallic. The man looked up from his work. He felt it before he saw it. The trees swayed harder than usual. Others in the camp paused too. The clouds thickened. A gust tore through the clearing, lifting ash from the fire. One of the hide shelters flapped hard. Another buckled at the corner. Rain began. Not a slow build-up, but a sudden wall. Water poured from the canopy. The fire hissed. A crack of thunder rolled over the ridge. A branch snapped off a nearby tree and crashed onto the edge of a lean-to. A child screamed. The man grabbed for the frame of his shelter, trying to hold it together. The hide pulled free. Cold wind and rain rushed inside. The woman beside him wrapped an arm around the children and pulled them under the rock overhang. Another shelter collapsed completely. A man nearby dragged someone from underneath. A limb was bent wrong. A woman shouted for help. The man reached her and saw the leg. Broken. Bleeding. He tore a hide into strips and bound the leg with split saplings. The storm kept going. One man had gone to check the hides drying on a rack beyond the ridge. He didn't return. They brought everything they could under the overhang. Food, tools, baskets, firewood. The fire had gone out. They buried coals in ash and covered them with stones. This method of insulating heat, used to restart a fire later, is shown by stacked hearth layers in multiple occupation sites. By morning the storm had passed. The ground was soaked, branches and leaves covered the camp. 2 shelters had fallen. Cord bindings had snapped. 1 child was bruised but able to walk. The woman with the broken leg was conscious but pale. The missing man was found under a tree. The trunk had split during the storm and crushed him. They pulled his body to a dry spot and piled stones over it. At some Paleolithic sites, cairn-like coverings over remains suggest this kind of protective measure, especially in cases where burial wasn't possible or practical. The injured woman was cared for. One person ground yarrow root into powder and packed it into the wound. Another chewed willow bark and gave her the juice. Both plants are known for their medicinal effects. Yarrow as an antiseptic, willow as a pain reliever. Traces of both have been detected in Neanderthal and early human dental calculus and burial contexts. The man and 1 child began rebuilding the shelter. They used salvaged poles and fresh saplings. One side was anchored into the earth. The arch was lashed with wet sinew. The hide was stretched back into place and tied down with bark cord. The fire was revived. Stones were removed. The coals were faint but still warm. Birch bark and pine resin caught flame easily. One of the children crouched nearby, feeding in small sticks. Food was limited. Some meat had spoiled. The group gathered what could be saved. Bones were split. Marrow was shared. A broth was made with roots and boiled bone shards. A woman who could not walk still sat upright and helped carve tools. Her hands moved slowly but with skill. Shanidar and other sites show signs of long-term survival in injured individuals, suggesting they continued contributing even without mobility. One child helped gather dry moss and laid it out on a flat rock to dry. Another twisted plant fiber into 2-ply cord. Even in disaster the camp functioned. Each person had something they could do. The sun came out later that day. The overhang dried slowly. Fire smoke clung to the hide walls. A woman used an antler tine to reshape a cracked spearhead. Another refastened the meat rack with bark ties. The man sat near the fire with a fresh flake. He trimmed the dull knife edge and handed it to a child. No words, just a nod. They did not speak much that evening. They ate in silence. The fire stayed high. The man who died was not spoken of directly. The stones marked his place. The others watched the sky and waited for the next task. The morning was cold but still. The storm had passed, leaving wet earth, broken branches, and scattered tools. The fire under the overhang was steady again, its coals revived from the stones packed over them the night before. The man stood next to the frame of his shelter. One child helped him retie the lashing where bark cord had split, another held the end of a hide sheet, while the man anchored it with a stone. The structure was smaller now, just enough space to keep dry and sleep. The old woman, her legs splintered, sat near the hearth. Her movement was limited, but her hands were steady. She sorted small bones, scraping dried fat from each one with a dull flake. She pointed once toward a stack of cracked ribs and gave instructions with a tilt of her chin. One of the children sat with her and offered a string of dried gut, already twisted. She nodded. This gut would serve as a tie or thread. Tools like awls and stone needles have been recovered at campsites where these materials were used for clothing, bags, and bindings. Another child checked a pile of drying bark strips. The strips would become caught, twisted by hand, looped into nets or straps. Fiber impressions in clay and residue on blades suggest this was a routine task, especially during recovery days when major activity slowed. A stone knife was retouched beside the fire. The man shaved down the back edge, refining the flake until it was even. Old flakes were kept until they dulled beyond repair. Most cores were struck only when new edges were needed, and this conservation is reflected in blade reuse patterns found at open-air sites. The injured woman drank hot broth, roots, marrow, boiled bits of tendon. The fat rose to the top and was skimmed off with a stick and stored. Nutritional analysis of hunter-gatherer diets shows that rendered fat was critical for long-term survival, especially during colder months. Later, the man and one child walked along a ridge, where runoff from the storm had cleared debris from a game trail. There, pressed into the soft ground, were tracks. Red deer. Two animals, one dragging a hoof slightly. The man looked at the trail, then at the child. The child nodded, crouched, and traced the line with a finger. They returned quietly. The sign had been noticed. A plan would follow. That evening, the child sat with a new spear. The shaft had been straightened, the point carefully bound. Another child sat beside a line of pierced fox teeth, threading them onto sinew. The ornament took time. No one asked why it mattered. These decorations, beads, teeth, bone discs, are found in burial contexts across Europe, especially in sites like Songir. They likely served as identity markers or expressions of memory. The fire was high again, bone grease sizzled on a flat stone. A flake blade lay beside the food pile, ready for cutting.
The children worked quietly. One dropped a marrow bone into the coals, listening for the crack. Another turned a meat strip, drying on the rack. The old woman handed a finished tool to the child nearest her. The handle had been wrapped with hide glue and sinew. Even unable to walk, she had contributed. The man sat back. He looked over the camp. It was not the same as before the storm, but it held. Survival continued. Knowledge passed on. The hunt would begin again tomorrow.